Good art is, in my opinion, quite political. It's something that has something to say. It's something that it stays with you in large part because it's something that's challenging in a particular way. And good politics relies on aesthetics, right? It relies on emotion. It draws from all those different aspects. And so in this way, I am sort of melding these two worlds. And my research project that I'm going to talk just a little bit about is about these two different areas. And the Ukrainian conflict, like the war in Ukraine right now, is something that is a perfect case study and one that is very personal for me, but is one that I think speaks to a lot of political scientists in particular because it is an incredibly powerful and important resource and moment and challenge for armies. And so what I wanted to talk about why this matters from like in a broader lens, right? And so when we talk about art in politics, like what it is a reflection of the people, it's a reflection of the narratives, and the things that we don't say, the things that don't exist, are also all reflections of politics. And I know this is like a very, this is a very general and kind of a trite statement, but I think it's really true. And it's a good jumping off point for everything that we're going to say today. And the same thing too, with politics, what it is it relies on the narratives that we construct for ourselves, the collective identities that we have in order to have legitimacy. And also when we're talking about questions of state and empire and who has the right to rule and who has the right to use force, like these are the big questions that that politics relies on. And I'm just going to actually put my phone here so I see the time. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the definitions that are important for the work that I'm doing, because the thing that I study is tangible cultural heritage. This is different from the intangible cultural heritage and the sort of broader legacies that people have that they gain. And this is, the tangible cultural heritage is everything around us, right? It's like the individual items and it's the spaces within them, right? And the reason that this is important for me to study is because it's something that's easy to measure. And again, political scientists really like this. But also because the things that intangible cultural heritage draws from, like these are the actions, the languages, the traditions, the culture, the history, they often are things that, because they are repeated and they are iterated on, there's something that they cannot be destroyed in the same way, but they must be recreated by virtue of the people wanting to do these things, by acting in these spaces. And the tangible cultural heritage is often sort of the touch point that people build off of. They're like the mementos, they're the things that we historically draw from in order to live those intangible moments in those lives. And this is the UNESCO definition. This is also an important definition for me because a lot of the legal frameworks that we borrow from, if people are interested in, in war crimes and genocide, if they are interested in prosecuting the things that end up happening, the criminality that can sometimes be experienced in war, these are the frameworks that people use. And so these, the tangible cultural heritage that I'm interested in comes from this space. And it's also, the reason that I'm really interested in this is because it's an asset that is underexplored and under-researched, in part because it's really hard to define, because it has competing values, right? Like you do have material ones. This is, art is a huge resource. Tangible cultural heritage, it's an incredibly valuable resource. We'll see it in some of the other slides later, but I mean, it's the third largest illegal resource behind drugs and arms. It's something that, it's when ISIS or Daesh invaded, and the first thing that they did in Syria, one of the first ministries they established was a Ministry of Antiquities, because there's so much money in this, right? And it's like an incredibly understudied area. And then the symbolic value, right? Like, everyone has a Vyshyvanka. Everyone here has places that they think of as these like either religious centers or monumental centers. Like you go to them, like when you have in Winnipeg, we go to If you didn't plan an event and you wanted to go and see Ukrainians for something, you would just go to the Shevchenko statue and everyone would just know to go there, not because it's a great location, the parking's terrible, but because it has a symbolic meaning, right? Like people really do, it draws you in an important way. And the strategic value, if you want to narrativize your claims, there's huge strategic value to this, right? Like this is super important, and this is part of the reason that we hear these talking points about, you know, like Kievan Rus coming out of the mouths of people who are trying to narrativize like Russian land claims as well, even though this is kind of collapsing very different historical narratives. And so this can take all sorts of, if you're going to target cultural property, there's lots of different ways to do it. And I'm not going to talk about sort of neglect or digital heritage. This is just something that is not part of my research project, but the different types, when we're talking about destruction, looting and trafficking, and the appropriation and re-narrativizing, like this is interesting and important to me because I think it sort of teases out different motivations. If what we're talking about is destruction, like what this is removing people's claims to important sites or this tangible cultural heritage, these symbols, right? Like this is important if you no longer want those narratives to kind of remain in existence. If we're talking about looting and trafficking, oftentimes this is the flooding of the market with art and antiquities. This is often sort of described in contexts where people want to profit from the what they've looted, the treasures. This doesn't even have to be treasure, right? Like, or it doesn't have to be artistic or cultural. Looting is a common feature in every conflict. And appropriation and re-narrativization, this is when pieces don't enter the open market, when they aren't things that have sort of a price tag attached to them, so much as they have, that they're found in different collections, and they're really important how we discuss them and how they're framed for other strategic actors. And so there's a long tradition of doing this in many conflicts. I mean, we could have done this whole presentation on just sort of historical moments, and in ancient Egypt, this iconoclasm is very, very popular when you had these emperors or the pharaohs come in, and you'd have a new dynasty come in. You know, you would see immediately sort of the re-narrativization through art, right? Iconoclasm is symbol breaking, right? Like it is this. It's a very important part of, if you want to make claims to power, it is one way of doing this. And the first sort of examples are ones where what your goal is, and what the goal was for so many of these conflict actors, is to make territorial or legitimacy claims. But that's not the only reason, right? Like you can go to war just for loot, for treasure, right? Vikings, conquistadors, this is a very also popular thing to do, and this was enough of a reason for armies to leave home and to risk quite a great deal for treasure. And the thing that in the more modern era, I thought these were really funny kind of images, because on the one hand we have the Nazi army looting the Soviets, and then I have some photos of the Soviets looting the German army in the same conflict. Because this is also, you know, when the challenge that you're making is about legitimacy, about territory, about like competing ideologies, this is one of the ways that people do this. And again, the Nazi looting was so systematic, like it was so organized, and it is something that is sort of held up as a professionalization of art looting. And so this conflict, which is one of the, it's often compared to this, which is the single most sort of organized looting historically. I think that that's sort of one of the things that people should really pay attention to when they think about what is actually happening in Ukraine today. And so this is, these are crates arriving, and a lot of this was returned to Berlin after the fact. But the Soviet army's approach was often also to target monuments, and the Germans as well, but the Soviet army had like a particular interest in taking down monuments and putting up their own as well. And so this I wanted to show you. I don't know if you're familiar with the Bamyan Buddhas. So this is again a much more contemporary moment, and this is them when they still existed in Afghanistan. The Taliban, one of their first acts when they came into power was to take down these incredible Buddhas that had been there for 1,500 years. And the reason that this example is, I think, interesting is because it also speaks to, when we're talking about, it's not just looting for, aesthetic value or for market value, it's political theater. It's art and it's destruction as theater. And I think one of the things that's interesting about contemporary conflicts, as well as, I think this was always the case, but with the spread of social media and the spread of the reach of sort of platform media, is that what you can see is a lot more of this performance aspect to iconoclasm and destruction of art and antiquities. And this is really true as well of Daesh and the Islamic State, because some of these spaces, there wasn't really some of the, like in Palmyra in Syria, there wasn't as much to loot in terms of the antiquities. Like these spaces had been sort of open air museums for 2,000 years, but they were also chosen as sites of just really horrendous crimes and executions. And in part they were that because they had this resonance, they had this incredible cultural resonance to the West, right? So they're more effective as propaganda tools. And if the thing that you're trying to control or re-narrativize or change is a civilizational narrative, it doesn't seem as though that's possible for us in our one generation, but it actually, these things don't take as long as it seems if you are able to really redefine things for your communities. And another thing too I wanted to show, just because this is an example of a successful prosecution, was in Mali, in Timbuktu, they had just an incredible library, and when the Islamic State came in, this was something that this is one of the first libraries Arabic speaking and on the continent, and this is also one of the first successful criminal prosecutions. But the reason this is also really interesting is because it was an incredible success story. Like there's books written about these people, these librarians, taking out the chassis in their trucks, and they smuggled out so many treasures. And again, I think it's kind of great. It's like a wonderful, example of people being able to, pull something kind of positive out of these stories. And what I do want to talk a little bit about is sort of the context in the political science context, because there are a lot of these, I think for a lot of audiences who aren't political scientists, maybe it seems a lot of this is quite straightforward, but there are these logics that come out of this, and putting them in the same framework as other type of strategic signaling mechanisms, of other type of like resource and extractive narratives is really important, I think, for us to think about art and also to think about Ukraine and the Ukrainian conflict. And so, like, selective versus indiscriminate violence, like this is something that armies often use and is sort of debated within all sorts of conflict scholarship. And it's whether or not you, as an actor, are choosing to say something to the people that you are targeting, right? Like, by targeting people who are behaving in a way that you disagree with, you are showing, like, the rest of the civilian population what is and is not tolerated, right? Like that's the mechanism here. And then indiscriminate violence is when it's sort of the blanket kind of terror that you are inflicting as an army. And there's lots of literature around this, because when you are in conflict, these things are an important thing that you're trying to communicate, right? Like, this is a strategic part of war. And the thing about tangible cultural heritage is, by virtue of its belonging to not only individuals but also the community, it's a really difficult thing to send signaling with, right? It is a difficult thing because you are both targeting this one space and you also are targeting a population, but it gives you the opportunity, if you are a person who's interested in signaling more broadly, it gives you the opportunity to sort of expand the type of signal you can send. So it's a really important signaling mechanism for armies. And these arguments as well about, like, resource endowments shaping behavior, this is this idea that, the richer you are, or if you have, like, the good or the poor fortune to be, in a space that has a diamond mine or a gold mine or oil, that you're much more likely to be in these conflicts. Like, these are, these resource blessings and curses. And the same thing too is that geography matters. What this sort of suggests is also that, you know, there will always be certain types of conflicts in certain types of spaces, and this is how people have framed it in the literature for a long time. And around sort of opportunistic violence, these are questions around whether or not, like, people, looting, destruction, this is just a weak state. So this is a framework that says, you know, states, armies have nothing to do with this. This is a sign of state collapse. And this is sort of the argument, is, you know, around a lot of the antiquities that flooded the market coming out of especially the Syrian and Iraq conflicts. They said that this was it was opportunistic. There was no other kind of like broader signaling mechanism at all. Like, no one cared about this. And this, a lot of the theorizing around this comes out of criminology or sometimes international law. But I think there's an increasing push to understand this type of violence within the lens of symbolism and identity. And this is, I think, particularly important for this conflict because it does have meaningful impacts on morale, right? When you, like, at the beginning of the war, when that airplane, the Maria, was targeted, like, that was a symbolic, that vessel, that was a symbolic target strategically, because it really did have a resonance for people, because just even the name of it, right? It was something that it really spoke to people. And what it does also do is, especially if you want to have really, really broad and deep reaching narratives, ones that I think are reflected in the way that especially colonial projects are narrativized. Historical narratives are really important, and longevity in, like, archaeological findings, sort of, they speak to this. They echo through time with this. And this is kind of, it's also interesting too, that there are people who, or groups who are better at the theatricality of this than others. And there's one, like, rebel group in Colombia, and one of the first things that they did, and they had no money, but they spent their time as well, they went and they stole and liberated the sword of Simon Bolivar. Like, Bolivia is named after him. He's a liberator, and, like, it's priceless, the value of being able to show that you are, you know, the heir to this kind of a legacy and this kind of a righteousness and this kind of a these kind of claims. Okay. And so what I think is important for us to take away from all of this is just that because of the complexity and because of the competing kind of goals about different actors and different tangible cultural heritage and at different times, it's important to think of this in these various ways. And so the project it's inherently a little bit complex just because of the virtue of the different motivations and the different pieces that are involved. But in this context, in the context of Russia and Ukraine, I wanted to just show a little bit about what is, so the first section is from UNESCO. UNESCO says that there's 514, this was from yesterday on their website, but this is only things that A, are UNESCO certified, which is, like, it's a very high bar for them, and B, it's things that UNESCO has verified through their own verification processes. 1.7 million is a conservative Ukrainian Ministry of Culture estimate, and what they are including in that is the items within these spaces, right? UNESCO only counts, like, the broader structures themselves, but there are so many things that are a part of this, right? This list is quite a way of glossing over what is really, truly a huge amount of cultural legacy, and just, you know, it's an inheritance, right? So so much of this is being glossed over, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of this. They're very reputable and they're doing great work in Ukraine, but 16.5%, that's a huge amount of the cultural artifacts in Ukraine. And 1.9 billion, again, I think that's the June statistic that I took, and it's so much more than that because it's hard to put a number on these things. And, you know, anyone who's worked in museum collections and who's ever been in archives or been in any of these spaces, like, you know that they're priceless, and part of the challenge is that they're irreplaceable ultimately. And this is just as true with the sites in Ukraine. And these, I could have chosen so many, but the Mariupol museums, there's nothing left there, right? So every institution is gone. The Primachenko Museum, you know, Pablo Picasso said that, of Primachenko, that the only thing he ever wished was to be able to paint like her. And, you know, her building the museum that her works were housed in is burned to the ground, and the Babin Yar Memorial, and, you know, for a regime that sort of narrativizes things around anti-Semitism being like one of the reasons that people are involved in these conflicts. For Babin Yar to be one of these targeted, I mean, there's nothing there. It's a park with a memorial, right? And these aren't strategic goals in the sense of, for most armies, but they are strategic if we think of these in this broader context. And even something like Slava House, right? Like, it's a modernist masterpiece of a building, and one that a lot of these writers that were writing within like they were true believers in some of the promises of like a new world, not necessarily of like a Russian world, but a new world that could be ushered in. And for the buildings like this to be targeted is kind of shocking. In Skovoroda Museum, I mean, for people who are philosophers for Ukraine, like, this is an important target in that sense, but in other ways there's nothing there, right? This is the Primachenko Museum that I wanted to show you guys here in Kyiv region, and so some of the looting as well. So I wanted to give you these examples because, like, the Kherson Art Museum, there's 11,000 pieces that were taken from there, and a lot of those people as well have very, they're important because of the breadth of the works that were there, right? Like, there are pieces from Greeks who grew up in Ukraine, like Arkhip Kunji, or there are pieces there of, you know, very old ceramic works, and they have just beautiful artwork from the interwar period. And in Melitopol, the Scythian gold in particular is just, it's also that long historical arc. And the thing about Potemkin's tomb, like, they took the headstone and they dug him up. So that was someone's job. That's not a thing that has a lot of open market value, but it's important in the narrative that you're telling. And, you know, they had to put him in a truck, and they had to ship him off. And they took a lot of very weird things because they have value in a sense that it's not necessarily material in the way we would think about it. And this is part of, like, the thing that animates me. Oh yeah, this is some of the Scythian gold here that you can see, just these beautiful pieces that have survived a very long time. And the reason that I bring up what Putin says about this is from an essay he wrote about 8 months before. I don't know, maybe some of you guys have seen this or read this. It's on the Kremlin website, where he talks about sort of historically who Ukraine is to Russia and our relationship, and, you know, and he brings up these historical moments, and they come from, he discusses the Mongol hordes in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He discusses, you know, the Soviet era, and he discusses all these people, and, like, he does touch on these historically relevant and kind of important moments, but the way that he narrativizes it is, you know, like a tragic mistake of Ukrainian, you know, misguided separation. But the reason that I put this up for you is because this is not my projection onto how Putin sees this, or how, you know, the Russian regime sees this. This is how they see it themselves, right? And this is part of the reason it's important in this Ukrainian conflict to not lose sight of some of these aspects. And I think for probably this audience, this isn't that shocking of a thing to say, but I think for other audiences, it might be more so. And yeah, and this, for some of you might even recognize this as Ilya Repin, and, you know, the reason that I put him here is because he's simultaneously celebrated by both Ukrainians and Russians, and he's in this space of, like, being claimed by both and being contested by both, and, you know, seen as a great Russian painter for people who want to see him as such, and he's held up by Russian academies as that. But he's also a very Ukrainian painter, and I think we can talk about him a whole bunch more later, but I have him in here for a very specific reason. And the other thing I want to say about sort of the cultural thing that is also not accidental is that there's been so much legislation that's come out in Russia since the full-scale invasion that targets specifically the museum and cultural sector. So there's legislation about not returning art and antiquities. There's legislation, there's propaganda museums that they've opened up. There's a lot of this has become part of this contested memory space that we're in. And so then it brings me to sort of my project, which is, disentangling all of these different motives. And I think that they're descriptively, they're qualitatively kind of obvious, but it's really difficult to actually map and to trace this. And one of the things that has been, that has been made possible by the Ukrainian war in a time which is, it's called the most documented war in history, is that we now have incredible tools that allow us to do this. And so there's a ton of satellite imagery. Actually, the Crimean Tatar community has this huge map of their own artworks that have been either sent into Ukraine or that have escaped or that are still in Crimea or that are now in other spaces, and they have excellent geotag data, which is a shocking thing that is wonderful, and I wish that other people were able to do what they're doing. But the AC LED data, they do conflict data, but they do real-time conflict data. It's by the day. I'll show you a map of this, and this is the kind of thing that can be compared to even, ideally, the data set that I'm compiling it's being cobbled together from all sorts of different people, and hopefully it's complete enough that I don't have to do this, but in the worst case scenario, filling in the gaps with newspaper and media reporting, and then triangulating it and putting it against the ACLED data. And then the thing about any kind of, I'm on the more quantitative side of this kind of scholarship, and in large part because of the ethics of working with people in wartime. I think it's a really, really challenging space to work in, and I think it's asking a lot of people. But I don't think that you can do a lot of really great scholarship if you don't have sort of domain knowledge. And one of the things that's really, really interesting and it's really heartening is there's so many stories about people who do so much. Like the Malian librarians, the Ukrainians are doing this stuff too. They're making miracles happen with almost nothing, and and I don't know, it is really heartening to get to talk to those people. And that will be my year and a year and a half. And so this is ACLED data from yesterday of strikes, and Miss Els, you guys can go and watch this in real time if you wish. And these are some of those organizations that I sort of mentioned there. This is just a tiny snapshot of them, but even something, so the Museum of Stolen Art, you can walk through, they have a digital kind of thing online where they will show you all these different artworks. And you can engage with the space. And all of these places, most documented war, they're taking oral histories because they see the way that they're looking at Ukrainian war and Ukrainian heritage is not something that is that needs to be documented for now. It's for the future, because they know that this war will end, and that there will be a time when Ukrainians want to really talk about their experience and about justice. And so, but they include a lot of these stories of people who are working in the same kind of space. And then government international bodies, it's incredible how much work that they're doing at the ministry in Ukraine, but also, and I think there is something here that I wanted to show you, but I won't get to. But the thing maybe that I will say now is that all of the things that I showed you today they're a little bit of the horrors of what's happened, and I don't mean to leave you on a really negative note, but I do want to say that part of the reason that these things are targeted is because they're very powerful, right? There is a reason that that armies will prioritize tangible cultural heritage, and it's in part because it is a thing that's very difficult to destroy, and it's also a thing that is very powerful for the people around them. And the things that I showed you today, all of those images, they're good news, bad news situations. So we started with a destroyed building, and the reason that I showed you that was because that's the one that Banksy came in and is one of the buildings that he put murals on in Kyiv. And the Scythian gold is stuff that was returned recently from the Netherlands. That's been an ongoing fight since the 50s. That was all returned to Ukraine. The Primachenko Museum is also a virtual walkthrough. If you want to see all of those artworks, you can go and see them. And the Ilya Repin is Shevchenko on the wall behind him. And these are all, they're symbolic and they're meaningful and they're things that people rally around. And the reason that I'm doing this, in addition to sort of my interest, is that, I worked at Osredok prior to this, and Osredok is an institution that was started in part, but it takes the village, it's a whole community, but one of the people was Alexandra, who is, if you guys don't know who he is, he's a musicologist and conductor. He was one of the first people who went to Kuban, and he recorded, and he has these notes of all of these Ukrainian folk songs of the people there, and that's someone else's dissertation project. They're all sitting in boxes, but he was the person who popularized at Carnegie Hall Shkandrij by Leontovich. And this is this thing that we now think of, like, people don't even know it's Ukrainian, it's just such a popular song. And he did this in the post-Ukrainian National Republic era, and he did it when Petlura sent him out, and Petlura didn't have enough money to pay for his own soldiers and didn't have enough money to pay for arms, and it was him and Avramenko and tons of other these cultural diplomats who were sent out to talk about what was happening in Ukraine, but more importantly to talk about that there is a Ukraine and that it's important for people to know that it existed. And like when he didn't have the money to pay for his army, he too made that choice, because this is just as much of a potent weapon as is other parts of armies and armed forces. And they were successful in a lot of ways. And when we sing these songs that we're re-singing, I'm hearing, for Koshitz, but in so many other spaces, when Kalush is winning at Eurovision, like they're borrowing from Ukrainian folk songs that people sang more than 100 years ago, and it's, in some ways, it's like deeply distressing because we're refighting all of these same fights and we're singing the same songs and they're still relevant. But the thing that I think is the takeaway that I hope for people that they have is just that when those people sang those songs, Ukraine was just a story, a myth, a possibility, and for us, we know that it's a reality. And so I think it's like the best part of this is that that's what it gave us, and that's really hard to take away. So
a lot of that stuff is being documented and digitized, so we actually have the virtual reality of the artifacts. When it comes to provenance, will that be legitimate enough of provenance so that if we go to reclaim assets from the Russians later on, that'll be a viable and legally based ability to claim ownership back?
Yeah, that's one of the challenging things, is that that's why the Russians passed those laws, right? Is because that's an attempt at changing provenance, right? Saying that this is already legally within these collections. And some of the collections were well digitized, some of these people were well resourced, some of them, were already on their websites, and then when you see it pop up somewhere else, it's a lot easier to have these sort of provenance claims. But a lot of these collections, they were very poorly resourced, and I think if you go to some smaller museums, you see it for yourself, or even just like the digitization of things. And this is something that I guess remains to be seen when it's when all is said and done and how this is litigated. But I think the attempt is to make it as challenging as possible to return this for reasons that I think are, yeah.
There's one thing for the Russians to codify the laws that allows them to steal and claim ownership of. But I'm thinking about the global world, whether it's art or literature, history, that we don't recognize their codification of their laws that allows them to steal or to keep. Is there any kind of a movement or any kind of a consensus coming out globally that what you say is yours, it does not mean it's yours. If we have the outside provenance to prove the point. I'm just thinking of all the stolen art, from World War II, the Nazis, that are still coming up. And they're still, it's still coming up, and slowly but surely are getting back to their rightful owners. So to me, that seems to be a huge area from a political push that we should be pushing. We'll get the stuff back when we get it back, but we need to make sure that we have our ducks lined up before.
Yeah, and I think it'll also, the Nazi example is an example where that ended in defeat for, the German army, and I think in part that assisted with that narrative. But because things like, the Elgin marbles and the Benin bronzes and so many other arts and antiquities and so many other museums all around the world, like those folks have also very legitimate claims, and, they still struggle. And so I think it really depends, but I'm very optimistic that, that everything will be home.
I'm just curious to see if in your research, if you've encountered any differences or similarities in how the Soviet Union took that property in comparison to today's war.
You mean how, like today Russia and Soviet Union Russia?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, right now it's both as unsystematic and as systematic, but I think like the difference is that the Soviet Union, after they had sort of territorial control, they were able to be a little bit more, organized and administrative, and thus far they've had really poor control over a lot of the spaces that they're in, and so again it remains to be seen because the Soviet Union is it stretches such a long time. And there's actually a really interesting scholar who is working out in Montreal who's trying to trace every piece that ever entered into the museum space in all of the Soviet states over the entirety of its lifetime. And yeah, and so it's really interesting to see like where this will fall within sort of like that broader scheme, and sort of like where those things have moved around, and how organized it will be at any point, right? Yeah.
Is there any sense by the Ukrainian researchers over there that have done the amazing work finding war crime perpetrators to these cultural crime perpetrators? Are there people working on that, trying to identify the individuals that gave the commands?
Yeah, I mean, some of those organizations, they really are interested in just like any kind of criminality. And a lot of the people who are working in this space, who are either, legal experts or people, like they're trying to document everything that they can. And because exactly that they want to have a version of sort of like bringing people to justice after the fact. But in terms of how they prioritize things, I think for them, if you're not working in this space, it's a little bit lower down. But if you are working in this space, there are a lot of people who are very interested, and it is a passion project for a lot of people. And when you do have people who can take it up, that's incredible, and that's so important. And it's just regular people as well with their cell phones. And the thing about, in terms of provenance, in terms of, after, when this all is said and done, like it will be very meaningful to have that kind of documentation. And so, yeah, I would encourage you index Most Documented War. There's an archive project that I can send you as well. Like they really do take seriously every story. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I have a question about a specific incident, and that's all about Ilya Repin. And I was delighted that you showed his famous painting of called in Russian Nezhdame. In English, they did not expect him, his family and everything. And on the wall behind him is Shevchenko, and perhaps Kulish. There's some arguments about that, but certainly Shevchenko is there. And the Russians claim him for Russia. Ukrainians claim him for Ukraine. And this debate has just exploded since this war started, especially since 2022. And during the first weeks of the war, the Russians captured his village, his home village, in, I think it's called Chirviv, in Sovietsko Ukraine, not far from Kharkiv. And then a few weeks later, only a week or two later, the Ukrainians recaptured it. Now, do you have any further information about what happened to his village? what happened to the Repin Museum in that village? I know that the curator is in exile in Britain right now, in England. But what happened to the contents of that museum? Were they able to get everything out, part of it out, or even recapture it? And could you tell us something about this debate about Repin and who he was and to whom he belonged?
I can't speak to the contents of the museum, but the fact that I don't know anything about it is probably a sign that it is, you know, that the artworks are in storage. But I mean, this is something I can look up afterwards. We can talk a little bit more about Repin. But yeah, he's an interesting person because like so many of these, you know, very important figures in like Russian art, Russian culture, like Hohol, Repin, like Malevich, like there's so many of these people who are held up, and that if these people who are sort of like on the world stage level, if these are the people who are re-narrativized as Ukrainian, and if all of these people who are sort of, you know, some of the most famous artists that you can think of when you think of like Russian art, right? Like if they are not part of that story and that legacy, then not only does it you know, give credence to Ukrainian kind of independence claims, but what it does is it really weakens sort of Russian identity and Russian identity claims. And I think the challenging thing with any of these people is that, you know, you can't ask them, and then that people often have really complicated identities. And just as much as, you know, as soon as you become famous in Canada as a movie star, you go move to Hollywood, you know, and you spend 30 years working in whatever, LA, a lot of these people also they took the opportunities that were given to them, and they, you know, had friendships in those spaces as well. But I think with artists like these ones, if they have diaries, if they have recollections of their time, and also reflected in their works and who they are, right? Like that's not the only painting that I could have chosen. He has the writing the letter to the Sultan ones. He has in that big fur coat that, you know, the like kožuch one. Like he has these thematic elements in his work that are so Ukrainian, and they're so. Like, he didn't have to make those paintings, and I don't even know who the audience was for something like that. He's speaking to it for himself, and I think it says a lot about who he is and how he thought about himself, and not like a Repin scholar, but I think for all of these people, like the challenging thing and the reason that they're so contentious is because they're so Ukrainian.
Can we use this, of course, in tragic events as an opportunity to build Ukrainian brand? So in a sense that, like, many of those pieces of arts and cultural heritage can be now recognized at the world stage as Ukrainian. So we have, like, people know more and more about Vyshyvanka, about Maria Primachenko's pieces of art, and so on and so forth. Like, can we draw on these, like, Irish people, building the Irish brand, like St. Patrick's Parade and a bunch of other things? So what can we do to really promote in there? In countries like Canada, the Ukrainian brand based on these pieces of heritage and try to build the Ukrainian identity, recognition of Ukraine, the Ukrainian brand, probably as we call it in the modern terms. So what can you do in your opinion?
I don't know what we can do to promote the Ukrainian brand, but I do think that this is kind of a moment. I think it is kind of an important one in the sense that people do, like, they are really celebrating being Ukrainian. There's more books published now in Ukrainian than ever before. Like, the industry is exploding, and they're being translated. And all these folks who, you know, who spoke Russian all the time at home, and that's not to say that if they speak Russian, they're not patriots, because that's how many battalions are staffed by, you know, Russian-speaking people at the front. But a lot of people, they made the switch, and they weren't able to get there, but all of a sudden had this moment, it had this meaning and this resonance for people. And the same thing is true, you know, when we're talking about music. And my father, when I was talking to him about, you know, everything that was happening, and he was just so sanguine about everything, and I was shocked. I was like, Tata, like, how can you be taking this in stride? And he's like, this is the first time, like, I've seen these horrible moments in history. This is the first time I didn't have to explain what Ukraine was to anyone, and everyone was automatically on side. And I think you know, it's a small mercy, and it's like not something really to be celebrated. But I do think that there is, in many ways, a legacy, like both externally and within Ukraine, and like speaking to both those audiences in a way that I think will be much more meaningful than I think, than I think we know yet, right?
I just read a very interesting interview with Viktor Yushchenko in the India Times. And he was talking about Ukrainian culture and how it is being used and how important it is to make sure that Ukrainian culture is recognized. And he did talk about Repin as one of the examples, and that his name was really Repa, and they Russianized it to Repin. So my question to you is, all of these things, when the war first broke out, I understand that there were attempts made to move some of these tangible objects out of Ukraine to protect them. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, there was a ton. There was a really organized movement, and a lot of things, they ended up either in Poland or they ended up in other parts. You know, a lot of Eastern museums ended up being able to ship really valuable parts of their collection further west. The Shevchenko Museum, who I worked with when I was at Oseredok, they moved all of their artworks. And their artworks are currently sitting in the same boxes that they were sitting in when the Nazis came in 1941, and they reused the boxes. And so, like, they were very organized. People spent a ton of their time, and they found, again, they made miracles happen. They found resources to, even if they didn't move them out, like the statues are covered with sandbags, like they appreciate the value of these things. And it's also, it's challenging too, because how do you move a library, right? It's not a non-digitized collection. How do you get something like that out? And people were very good about prioritizing sort of the most important aspects of their work, but a lot of stuff wasn't as well. And one thing that's also kind of interesting too is, you know, in the digital space, which I'm not working in, but there's a ton of institutions that immediately when the war started, they gave up server space, like the Indiana, the Folklore Institute there, they made available as much storage space as people needed, and so there was also a push to digitize collections and then have them live there. And so people worked, and they're still working. That's what they're doing right now while we're sitting here, is they're scanning books and they're doing the same kind of work. It's also a thing that I think if people don't work in these sectors, it's hard to understand. It's not like a sexy thing to raise money for, is like archival Hollinger acid-free boxes. And so it's really hard, and it's hard to do it here, let alone in Ukraine. And so, yeah, those folks definitely need help and assistance, yeah.
So currently in Lviv at the Zanik Art Gallery, there is an exhibit called Kherson Nevkradek, which is interesting because it's all of the collections that are available. How much do we make ourselves a target by having these kind of exhibits going forward?
You mean to sort of like Russian targets, or?
Yeah, Russian targets, because some of the articles that I read was, well, at the Kherson Museum, they stole a bunch of copies. The originals we still have. Mm-hmm. We're almost taunting them to kind of go after the originals.
Yeah, but it's like, I don't know. I think it's just saying then we shouldn't have nice stuff, or we shouldn't be doing this sort of thing. I think that's a meaningful thing to do, is to show those originals and even just, to show what's missing, to show it's still there. And I think it is quite celebratory, right? Because again, it's really easy to see all these images constantly of bombed out Ukraine and just like everything reduced to rubble, but life goes on and people are really active. And I think, I think it's more important just to focus on the fact that, this is part of that sort of train of erasure. And if people give in to that sort of erasure thing, I think that's a real danger. And there's other museums who have, like the Kyiv National Gallery, they have a really cool digital exhibition as well. And what they have is all the artworks that are there. And then they have spaces from the original photographs of the artworks that are missing, and they show who has it. So these ones were looted by the Nazis, and these ones were looted by the Soviets, and they show you where it is if they have it, and they leave the space empty for you. And I think it's like, I don't know, it is simultaneously resilient and celebratory, and I think it's challenging because these things can become targets. And if you do have the locations of these spaces, that is it's a hard thing because you have these treasures. But I also think if you don't continually do this, then it is sort of giving into something that I think is not to be given into.
Hi. My question actually is, so we have Ukrainian cultural heritage is there a role for us in terms of the current Ukrainian situation in Ukraine? Should we do our work here? Should we be reaching out to them? What do you think?
I think that's for everyone to decide for themselves, but I do think that, you know, being Ukrainian and working in these spaces here is also really important. And I think that, you know, part of the reason that some of these collections ended up in Canada, and they ended up in the Czech Republic and in Germany, and they ended up because, you know, people understood the value of these collections and how important it was, and in the same way that, you know, the Koshets with Avremenko is coming out into the world, like this is a version of that. And I think, you know, it's for each of us to decide the best way to do it, but I think not forgetting the kind of work that they're doing there is really important too, because, you know, they're doing the same thing we're doing, and God knows it's really hard to work in a museum, but they're doing it under incredibly difficult conditions, so. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I know that my question may not be directed to your presentation, but it's about your research. So you mentioned that, part of your work as a PhD student is using analytics and artificial intelligence for, as much as it's good potentially for policy-based decision-making. So what you see as perspectives, and of course you mentioned using analytics and also open source intelligence here for identifying the pieces of stolen art, but in general, what's your view as doing research in this field about use of artificial intelligence? And I cannot basically stand without asking a question about artificial intelligence because I work in this field, and they probably, some of us have seen the QFT, University of Toronto was ranked #3 worldwide in the AI field just recently. So can we use AI for basically making policy-based decision-making based on data, based on analytics, based on artificial intelligence, and what's your view on that?
I mean, I'm generally I think it's a really important tool, and I think it should be conceived of as a tool. Like, it makes my life and my workflow, and it makes so much of the things that we do easier, right? Like, it's baked into everyone's lives, right? It's in the algorithm that is making recommendations for you at every level. It's in the thing about your shipping lanes. It's in, you know, like the little lines underneath your Word document. It's using these like prediction-based mechanisms, like it's everywhere, right? And I think that being sort of scared of it and, you know, not using it and not incorporating it is a little bit of a mistake. But I also think it's important to also sort of understand its limitations, understand that, you know, at the end of the day, the most important thing is like the human decisions and the people that we're accountable to, and like how we use those tools in our lives. And so I think at the policy level, and this is something that, especially if you're on the quantitative side, that you tend to encounter people who are very excited about the methods and the tools. But I think like my biggest critique of them would be that if they're not steeped in like the theories that come from us, and also the policy is like the ramifications, the prices we pay, and we're accountable to each other for those. It's not going to be some, you know, hallucinating AI for that. And so I think like balancing those two things, but I mean, in general, I'm pro. I think you can do more things, and I think where the data comes in is that when you're speaking to people and you want to make a really convincing argument, when you show that to someone, like that allows you to make the arguments around policy and theory that you wanted to make because you drew it from life, right? Yeah. One more, or that's it? Yeah. Okay, perfect timing then. Yeah.